There's a group of scientists that has just discovered that there is no biological basis for transgenderism. Can you believe that these people get paid to do this? Can you imagine how much these scientists got paid, the funding they had to conduct this study, to know what every 3-year-old knows? That's amazing. But it's good that they're doing it because our culture is so crazy that it takes courageous scientists to go out and buck the politically correct norm. But this is an international group of over 100 clinicians and researchers who have attested that there is no biological evidence for gender identity. They've observed that no laboratory test can distinguish a trans-identified person from a non-trans-identified person. What they write, quote, "The assumption of the core biological underpinning for gender identity and gender dysphoria remains an unproven theory. While biology likely plays a role in gender nonconformity, currently there is no brain, blood, or other objective test that distinguishes a trans-identified from a non-trans-identified person, once confounding factors such as sexual orientation, meaning desire, are controlled for." This is according to the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. Okay, I'm glad that they're debunking this idea that you'll sometimes hear this among the most eccentric and incoherent transgender activists. They'll say, well, you know, the brain of a man who identifies as a woman, it's actually closer to a woman's brain. Which is funny because the libs for years told us there's no difference between the brains of men and women. Do you remember that? Do you remember in the days of feminism when we were told there absolutely no, the only differences between boys and girls is a few secondary sex characteristics, but the brains are exactly the same. How dare you say that women have different brains than men? Until they wanted transgenderism, and then they said, no, of course the brains are totally different. But there's never been any scientific evidence for that. The reason that some transgender activists have made that argument is because they're materialists, and they're atheists, and they don't believe in the soul, and they don't believe in metaphysics, and so they can't discuss these issues of anthropology in a sophisticated way. The only thing they can talk about is just stuff and matter. So they have to ground the soul, which is what they're really trying to talk about, in something physical. And they know they can't ground it in the visible physical attributes of a person. So they say, oh yeah, it's somewhere in the brain. Yeah, somewhere in the brain that you can't see, that's where you find out that a boy's really a girl. But that never made sense. And the more serious and intellectual transgender activists will be more honest. And what they will say is there's a difference between sex and gender. And sex is your physical state, and gender is your non-physical state. So physically you could be a man, but metaphysically you're a woman. And what they're really talking about there is the soul. And these guys are a little more sophisticated and intellectual in the way that they're talking about it, but it still doesn't hold up because then you have to ask, okay, well, what is the relationship to the body and the soul? And the relationship between the body and the soul is that the soul is the substantial form of the body, that the body is a symbol of the soul. And so the two are linked. And the technical term for this is hylomorphism. This is how Aristotle describes the relationship between form and matter, between the metaphysical stuff and the physical stuff. And very quickly, not to go down a long discourse on ancient Greek philosophy, but very quickly, this conversation goes over the heads of the transgender promoters because they want to talk about the soul when it gives them some way of justifying their absurd idea that a man can really be a woman. But they don't want to go so far as to have a serious conversation about the soul. They're not capable of doing that because when you do that, when you raise this possibility that the soul is entirely different from the body, that the soul can be in total opposition to the body, their argument, I think at that point falls apart. But then it especially falls apart because if you're saying, okay, these two things are entirely distinct and you want to bring them into conformity with one another, well, then that raises the obvious question, okay, if my soul is one thing and my body is this other thing, why do I have to change my body? Why can't I just change my soul? Why can't I just change my mind is really the question that comes up. If I'm a man, I look like a man, but my mind tells me that I'm a woman. Well, just change my mind. I change my mind about things all the time. I say, hey, I want sushi for lunch. And then my buddy says, hey, actually, I want to get burritos. I say, okay, let's get burritos. There we go. I just changed my mind. It's very easy to change your mind. It's very hard to change your body. It requires extremely painful surgeries, extremely expensive surgeries, sterilizing yourself, grafting off your skin from your legs and your arms to create this grotesque caricature of genitalia. Why don't you just change your mind? All of that falls apart. All of which to say, getting back to this scientific document, debunking the biological basis for gender identity. Yeah, obviously that's true. Obviously there's no biological basis for these sexual delusions of boys who think they're girls. It's important to establish that. But it doesn't answer the question. The question of transgenderism is not, is it physical? The question of transgenderism is it real? Yes, I know gender identity is not in your brain somewhere. It's not in your hands. It's not, but not every real thing is physical. Love, language, geometry. Most things that we hold dear are not physical, but they are nonetheless real. So I think conservatives have fallen into this trap too, and I suspect a lot of these scientists are relatively conservative compared to the culture, and they want to ground everything following the Enlightenment and following the scientific revolution and following modern liberalism. They want to ground every single thing in something physical and say, well, if it's not physical, if I can't see it under a microscope, then it's not real. Okay, I guess that will help you make certain calculations about certain physical phenomena, but most of the stuff that we care about in the world is not physical. We all behave every moment of every day as if we believe that there is more to the world than just the physical world. So then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the nature of the metaphysical world? And is there such a thing as gender identity there? Is the soul totally distinct from the body? What religion are we living under? Okay, and because for most of our country's history, we took those questions seriously and came to relatively reasonable conclusions about that, namely various interpretations of Christianity, some far more precise, some a little less precise, but that was what animated our country. That's what our founding fathers said. That's what the men who developed not only our country, but our civilization said. Okay, I get that. That gives me a grounding of who we are and what we're all doing here together. As that has fallen apart because of our ignorance and sin and vice, as that has fallen apart, now we're very, very confused. And men are chopping off their genitals, and equally confused men are taking the oath of office in the U.S. Congress on a comic book. Not great. Speaking of getting back to Christianity, Bible in a Year, which you've heard me mention on the show many times, heard me mention today, Bible in a Year remains one of the top podcasts in the country. Bible in a Year right now is the number 3 podcast in the country according to the charts. Do you know what the number 2 podcast is? The Bible Recap, which is another Bible podcast, this one put out by D Group. Do you know what the number 1 podcast in the country is? Catechism in a Year, also with Father Mike Schmitz, who does Bible in a Year. This one Catholic priest is the host of 2 of the 3 most popular podcasts in the country, one of which is on the Bible, one of which is on the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And then the podcast that's wedged right in the middle of those 2 is the top 3, is also a Bible podcast. This is great news. I know there's all terrible news in the culture and in the politics. This is great news. What that tells me is not that our country is totally fine right now. Not that actually we're still a serious Christian country that has our act together. It doesn't tell me that. But it tells me that there is a longing in the country to return to that which is true and good and beautiful. There is a longing. We're not there right now. If we lived in a country that had its act together, spiritually, personally, politically, I suspect that Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year probably wouldn't be the top 3 podcasts. I suspect you might have some religion shows as the top podcasts. It might be Father Mike Schmitz, but they would be more advanced. They would be on the lives of the saints. They would be on the doctors of the church. They would be on more technical aspects of the faith, I think, probably. Because we would all know our Bible really, really well. We would all know the Catechism really, really well. The Bible in a Year podcast is, it's edifying for people who have been in the church their whole lives, but it's also totally acceptable to people who are just questioning, who don't even know what they believe. catechism in a year is that primer. Okay, what does it mean to be in the church? What does the church say? What has the church taught for 2,000 years? It's totally open and accessible and can be very basic for people, which is a wonderful thing because it's people who have been raised basically without religion who recognize, wow, something has gone horribly wrong here. Whatever, I don't know what it was, but something broke in the last 70 years. And I want to get back to that thing that we lost. That's absolutely great news. The rest of the show continues now. You do not want to miss it. Become a member right now. It is Fake Headline Friday. I need your help to guide me along as Virgil guided Dante as I try to discern which of the 5 headlines that my producer Ben Davies has given me is the fake headline. So head on over to dailywire.com, use code Knowles at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. dailywire.com/Knowles.